And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. You know, last time we talked about this fact that from the book of Genesis and throughout the Old Testament that we worship a God who has come near to us. And then in the Gospels, we see that the time for Jesus to come, the time for that prophecy made by Isaiah that there would be a virgin and the virgin would give birth to a son and she would name him Emmanuel, God with us. And John tells us that indeed the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He tabernacled among us. And that's such an amazing thought that the King of all of heaven left the majesty of heaven to enter into the mess of the earth here as we experience it, and especially as we're experiencing it this Advent season. So we have a God who came down from heaven, that he dwelt among us, that he came down also in the middle of redemptive history, that this Emmanuel, this Jesus, this Messiah, this God with us came down in the middle of redemptive history, not to end redemptive history, but to give us promises and to give us hope in the midst of redemptive history. And so we know that we have a God who was fully God and fully man. And people smarter than me call that the hypostatic union, that there is this mystery how Jesus could be fully man but also fully God. And we know that this God of heaven and earth, that he condescended, that he came near to us. And this is so remarkable about Jesus and about our Emmanuel God, both from the Old Testament, from Genesis chapter 3, when he walked with mankind in the garden, throughout the Old Testament, when he traveled with Moses as he was leading them to the promised land. And as we see kind of the climax of redemptive history when Jesus comes in the flesh as Emmanuel, we know that we have a God who is with us. And his disciples describe what it was like to be present with Jesus. And Peter tells us that he was an eyewitness of his majesty. What might it be like to be an eyewitness of the majesty of God? To see God in the flesh and to dwell among him. God of the Father of the Old Testament was around his people in the garden and in the tabernacle. And now we see Jesus, and Jesus is among his people. And John goes on to tell us in his first epistle that he has seen and felt and actually handled Jesus, that he has been in the presence of the Word made flesh, that he has been in the presence of Emmanuel, God with us. And as Jesus begins his public ministry, he begins to talk about the fact that not only has he come near, and not only is he Emmanuel, God with us, but Jesus has brought with him the kingdom of heaven. 32 times just in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus references the kingdom of heaven, and he says things like, the kingdom of heaven is here, the kingdom of heaven is now, and blessed are those who are pursuing the kingdom of heaven. So 32 times in Matthew's gospel, Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven. And what does it mean to not just worship a God who is with us, but what does it mean to worship an Emmanuel God who brings with him the kingdom? And in Matthew's gospel, we see that when the king comes, the king brings the kingdom of heaven, but he also brings healing. And Jesus performs all of these miracles, especially in Matthew's gospel, beginning in Matthew chapter 8. And we see just like one right after the other, these miracles of Jesus. And I believe that Jesus was showing us that what is to come, that he's going to come and he's going to come in his fullness and he's going to come in victory and he's going to come and restore the earth. But until that time comes, he gives us a little glimpse of what that healing is going to be like. And in the Gospels, he heals his people of diseases. He heals the lepers. He heals the man born blind, and he heals the lame, and he heals the woman who has been hemorrhaging for 12 long years. So Jesus brings healing over disease. Jesus also brings healing over death. The Sadducees, or the the synagogue leader's daughter, Jesus raises her from the dead. Jesus raises his friend and beloved Lazarus. And Jesus raises the one and only son of the widow of Nain and has compassion on her. So Jesus in the Gospels is a God with us, and he is a God who is present over disease, and he is a God who is present over death. And Jesus heals of demonic forces and evil, and we see that throughout the gospel. He healed Mary Magdalene of 7 evil spirits, and he healed the man at Gerasene of the demons that were within him. And so we know that as a God who is with us, that he brings healing over evil in the world. And then God also brought healing over the destructive forces of nature. When he calmed the sea and he walked on the water, he demonstrated that he has the authority even to command nature. So as we contemplate this week, what does it mean to worship a God who is with us, an Emmanuel God who is present with us, an Emmanuel God who is bringing with him and brought with him the kingdom of heaven, and an Emmanuel God who brings healing over disease. He brings healing over death. He brings healing over demons and evil. And he brings healing even over the destructive forces of nature. And Jesus makes a promise as he's about to leave his disciples, and he's been crucified, and he's been buried, and he's been resurrected, and he conquered death, and he conquered the grave. And he is about to ascend, and he brings his disciples up on the mountains, and he promises that he will always be a with them God, that he will always be their Emmanuel God. And he says this to them, and he says, "Lo, I will be with you always, even to the very end of the age." So my question for us as we contemplate this second session of our Advent series, Emmanuel, God with Us, is, what does it mean to live in the hope of the kingdom of heaven and a God who will always be with us throughout the end of the age?